Artificial intelligence, or AI, is a rapidly growing sector that is set to reshape many industries. With industry analysts predicting the global AI market to surpass $1.3 trillion by 2030, AI's potential to transform businesses and societies is undeniable. The confidence in AI led to a surge in venture capital investment in AI-focused startups in 2023, and the trend continues into 24. So what is it like for CEOs of startups in this space as they raise capital and develop groundbreaking AI products? In this episode, you'll hear from Sarah Nagy, a former quantitative analyst, or quant for short, who is the CEO and co-founder of Seek AI. This leading startup provides organizations with a natural language processing interface for data analysis. The company is focused on empowering anyone in a business to ask questions and quickly receive data-driven insights. You'll hear how Sarah's time as a quant in the finance industry and working at AI startups offered her a unique perspective on using AI to improve the process of providing data analysis across large organizations. She talks about pitching venture capital investors, the key elements they're looking for in an AI-focused startup, and what it's like transitioning to the CEO role and scaling the business. Sarah has a master's degree in finance from Princeton and a dual bachelor's degree in astrophysics and business economics from UCLA. Sarah, welcome to our podcast series.
Thank you so much for having me.
So happy you could do this. You know, to get things started, and I want to talk a little bit about the journey. So why don't you share with our audience your journey and what's the passion that drove you to a career in both data science and data analytics, and the pivotal moments that led you to the founding of Seek AI?
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit of a long story because I actually started out as an astrophysics researcher at UCLA and Caltech. I was working with data from the Hubble Space Telescope at the time. I kind of heard about quantitative finance, while I was doing that. And the thing I really liked about quantitative finance in particular was, I was always more of kind of like a math person, kind of really liked the idea of continuing to just work with numbers, work with math. I didn't necessarily know that was possible in finance. I knew about investment banking, but I didn't necessarily know about that there were actual mathematicians on Wall Street. So that seemed like a great career path for me. So I moved out to the East Coast. I actually went through a program at Princeton called the Master in Finance program, which kind of specializes in taking people from STEM backgrounds and training them to become quants. And I started out as a quant at a company called ITG, which was doing trading execution. So I was doing that for a couple years, basically designing these trading algorithms to execute customers' trades. I then kind of got interested in more data science, which was an emerging career, believe it or not, around 2015 or so. The thing that really was interesting to me in the finance world was that there were all sorts of really interesting data sets that were popping up that I felt would contain a lot of alpha. And it was kind of this emerging world called alternative data. And so I ended up just joining a startup called Predata that was actually scraping data from Twitter, Wikipedia, YouTube, and trying to just amalgamate it into these signals that, ideally could predict all sorts of information about various asset classes. So I worked at Predata. I got a lot of exposure to the startup world as well. Predata ended up getting acquired by a company called FiscalNote, which then went public. After Predata, I went to a different startup called Edison, also in that same kind of space. I helped to actually build and launch their hedge fund vertical out in New York. And that kind of led to some success of them merging with a different company called Yipit that was also focused on hedge funds. And then that merged company became a unicorn. And after that, I went to Citadel. I was leading a data team there, also doing alternative data research for the consumer sector. And that was basically my career prior to starting Seek. And so what kind of led me to start Seek was by that time, I had been working at 4 different places. And every single place, I just kind of kept noticing this same pattern of inefficiency. I really thought I would be doing pure research when I got into this field. Like, I really expected my role to be adding value to the business by looking at the data, finding interesting signals, interesting sources of alpha that could make money for the business. Most of the day, I was helping non-technical people with just basic questions about data. It was just kind of surprising because they had tools, and I was like, why can't they just use the tools, and why do they have to go through me? But it's just these questions were really hard for the tools to help them with, whereas I was an expert on the data. That was really the pain point, so to speak. And around 2020, that's when I got to a point where I started noticing large language models getting better and better. Like, I had actually been following large language models since 2018 with GPT-2. And so by 2020, that was when we saw GPT-3.
Right.
And I was, wow, this is so much better than GPT-2, especially at writing code. And that was like this totally new thing to me, where I was like, I did not know machine learning models could write code. And so I was like, okay, these models can understand what the non-technical people are asking for. Like, it's really good at understanding natural language. Oh, I could get these models to write the same kind of very repetitive code that I had to write to help them. So that was kind of the realization that led me to start Seek.
Anybody you're looking to invest money into an organization, they're going to ask you, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And I guess from what I'm hearing is that you feel as though the users out there, the people that need to look for an answer, oftentimes then have to go to a person, as opposed to using a model that you've created in order to gather the data together to answer that question rather than go to a person. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, exactly. And in large companies, it gets to be a really, really unscalable situation, because pretty much every professional needs data to be able to do their job effectively. Mm-hmm. And, without Seek, it's like people are kind of forced to put 100% of new questions that they have, that they can't find in the existing tools. These new questions have to go through a human. They have to go through the data team. There's no other way. And so if you get, a really large company with 100,000 employees and they all want to ask brand new questions, you've got to hire enough humans to help with that.
Right.
And so that's a fundamentally unscalable kind of scenario. And Seek is making that scenario scalable by automating some of that work with AI.
I thought about this, and I thought how remarkable, how brilliant it is that, so many companies, they collect data for a variety of purposes. They're measuring things that are important, typically within silos, right? So you've got the sales team, they've got their own information they're looking for. You've got manufacturing, whether or not they put together capital budgets, acquisition numbers, sales, marketing, etc. It all relates to making an informed analysis and some decision. And this means users have queries from very diverse perspectives and uses. By the way, differing analytical skills, so they have to know what to ask. How does your product sort of level the playing field for all these diverse groups?
Yeah, I think an example of what you described is when people ask questions, they can ask literally the same exact question, but it can mean two totally different things. Like sales and HR might both ask, what was our churn last month? But churn could be defined as, it could be employee churn or it could be customer churn. So we kind of solve that problem with, a lot of it isn't even with AI. Some of it is just basic best practices that already exist in the modern data stack community. One example is just having governance within the product, where you can actually just have different groups of people that have access to different types of data and different types of metrics. So that's a really easy way to do it. Where it gets a little more complex and where you kind of need the AI is if you do have closely related questions that might need to be disambiguated. If you have how many VPs of engineering do we have versus how many engineering leaders do we have?
Right.
Those are very closely related questions, but the data may be totally different. So the AI does need to be intelligent enough to be able to differentiate between those kinds of questions.
Interesting. The other aspect of this is, in your ability to use natural language queries to interact with the client's database, there has to be some sort of a taxonomy or terms that are applied to describe or classify data. It's got to be fairly challenging in terms of data mapping before you get any sort of meaningful results. Does this result in sort of a customized product for each client as you go through their database and what's information is important to them and how to describe things?
Yeah, so I have a couple of answers to that. I actually like to quote Gordon Ramsay. He has this phrase, let the knife do the work for you, meaning when you're chopping something, like, don't stress your arms and hands, try to rely on the knife to just be sharp and do the work for you. We like to use the deep learning and let it do the work for us. So what I kind of mean by that is, just the deep learning technology can learn a lot of these things on its own. Just if we feed it in data that we collect from the customer up front to train the model, like the Seek model can learn a lot of the patterns on its own. There's not a ton of customization that we're doing by hand for every single customer. It's kind of funny because like the platform itself does adapt to each customer. It's a little different from most products in the AI space in that regard. Like ChatGPT, everybody gets the same ChatGPT that's been trained on the web, but each of our customers actually has a different Seek that's trained on their own data. And so it's able to learn a lot of the nuances that you need. Like imagine you're training a new person on the data team.
Right.
You need to know exactly how to query the data, all the different types of calculations. But the deep learning can pick up on most of that kind of stuff so that it can just learn those conventions on its own. The thing I will point out that we do need from the customer sometimes is they do have certain metrics that need to be defined, like the churn example, for example.
Right.
We do need that information from the customer. Otherwise, how are you going to know to map which natural language to which metric? But it doesn't need to be a lot of work building out like this super, super detailed knowledge graph. It can really be pretty lightweight, but it is still needed from the customer if they do have metrics like that.
Wow, it's fascinating. So the more I think about it, considering where Seek fits, it actually, you're not locked into any one industry vertical. Your product could work in financial services and banking, consumer products, virtually across several verticals without doing a lot of work. I kind of thought there was a lot of spade work involved initially, but it sounds like, given that it's somewhat self-learning, it can be applied in a variety of different verticals.
Yeah, I've always kind of thought that about Seek ever since I was founding it. I had worked with Snowflake before, and I always kind of admired that Snowflake was kind of seen as this ubiquitous infrastructure product.
Right.
And so when I was starting Seek, even though my background is 100% finance, I was like, this can really work anywhere. And I really wanted it to be as scalable as Snowflake. So yeah, the product itself is, even if two of our customers are in the same exact vertical, Seek is going to just learn about each customer mostly from scratch. When I say mostly, I mean entirely.
Are you currently working across a variety of different verticals with different companies at this point?
We have a few verticals that we're pretty focused on. Mm-hmm. They're pretty broad, like consumer, finance is one of them, healthcare, tech. It's like a super broad vertical, but what I mean by that is there's some hardware tech, there's some like consumer tech. Yeah, fascinating. And one of the things, though, that when you're getting answers back, this is part of that human element that I'm going to ask you about here, because it comes down to the degree of confidence that you have in the results. I've used like ChatGPT, well, different iterations, and you've always noted that if you repeat the question, you'll get a different response. So how do you test for accuracy, and at what confidence levels do you see coming out of what Seek provides to the user? Well, we like to use a metric called execution accuracy. That means when Seek gives an answer, is it the same data that the customer would write by hand? That's the metric that we're focused on. I will point out, we do have the record on a benchmark called Spider, which measures text to data. It's kind of the most well-known benchmark in the space. Our model, MiniSeek, was the first to surpass 90%, still at the top of the leaderboard to this day. And so, that's an example of kind of the research our AI team is doing to just ensure that the model itself is the most accurate that it can be. But on top of that, we also have other types of guardrails that, prevent business users from getting bad data. But that's like the number one product principle that even from the very, very beginning, like 2021, I saw that these models could hallucinate, but it wasn't a big deal to me. I was just like, okay, model's not always going to get it right. Checks out. I have a machine learning background, so that was not surprising. But But I was like, okay, I've just got to build stuff into the product to make it so the business users just aren't exposed to this. And we ended up actually applying for patents for some of that technology. So yeah, I mean, we've had, in addition to trying to just make the model more accurate, just having a workflow for what happens when it's not accurate.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and again, as a user, this technology gets better day by day. So I would imagine, you're trying to get to that ultimate confidence level. So if I need to make a very critical decision, obviously I'm the human guardrail, right? I have to say, does this make sense to me or not? But the system is actually checking itself, I would imagine. And as you're learning, you're getting better at it.
Yeah. So the system itself does have confidence thresholds. So Seek is actually going to do a self-assessment of how confident am I in the answer. And if Seek is highly confident, you are going to get the answer faster. But if it's not confident, it is going to go through a workflow so that business users are always getting the correct answers.
Yeah, because one of the things that in data science, you look at outliers and anomalies. So if you've got something in the data that doesn't really make sense, or as we talked about churn, and all of a sudden I see a huge spike. All right, do I make that part of my predictive analytics, or was that a one-time event because something happened? And sort of how do you peel back the data? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, you can just ask Seek. You can be like, yeah, what was our churn every day for the last month, year over year, whatever you want to know. Mm-hmm. And if you do see a big spike, you just ask Seek about it. What caused the big spike? Or if you already kind of have a hypothesis, you can also ask, show me all the data from that day of the spike. You can actually have a chat with Seek to kind of dive deeper into that as well.
That's amazing. It's unbelievable stuff. What amazed me that since the inception of Seek in 2021, you've navigated 3 rounds of funding. You've secured an impressive both pre-seed and seed funding into the company. Business appears to be advancing at an extremely rapid pace. Could you share some of the challenges you faced in scaling the business and how you successfully transitioned to the role of CEO?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're in the AI space, I was really early. I was building with large language models in 2021. I think an interesting challenge for me was, I wouldn't say I was too far ahead, but I was definitely uncomfortably far ahead. It was kind of annoying for me to have to explain large language models. I have some funny stories, I'm almost like, I feel so old talking about this, even though this was only 2 years ago. But it's back in my day, I had to explain what a large language model was. And then ChatGPT definitely did change everything. I honestly really appreciated that it came out because, yeah, people were so educated about large language models and we're definitely more on the same page as me. And then this year, it's even better because people are now pretty up to speed about things like agents and definitely also just the need for guardrails. I think that people appreciate some of the things we've built into Seek that maybe last year, if they learned about the human in the loop workflow piece, they might be like, oh, I don't want that. Human has to be in the loop sometimes. But now I think a lot of people are like, yeah, I mean, that's the only way to do it, especially if you're an enterprise and you have zero tolerance for inaccurate data.
Right. It's truly incredible. And looking at some recent statistics, although the overall volume of venture capital has come down a bit, the investment in AI in particular just continues to lead the pack. I mean, so many people are interested in this space. And that brought me to thinking about, because we have a lot of young people, a lot of entrepreneurs that listen in, sort of give me your list of top, let's say 3 things that investors in the AI space are looking for in a new venture.
I think the biggest thing is, do customers love the product? That's probably the number one thing, especially if you're just starting out and you're trying to get your first round. I think a good AI investor is probably going to look for that first versus any sort of revenue statistics. Mm-hmm. So I think that's number one. Being able to demonstrate that you're a high quality founding team is another big thing. I really think anybody can position themselves in a way that can demonstrate that they're a really good founder. It obviously helps if you have some sort of pedigree, but I know most people don't have that. But I think what you can do is show that you were able to get a couple of customers. They don't even have to be customers. They can just sign letters of intent, which means they want to use the product. And if you can show hey, I built this product I got these letters of intent that show that people are excited about it. You're already ahead, I think, of the vast majority of founders. And also, like, if the product works well, like if you're able to do a good job building the product or like finding someone good to help you build the product if you're not technical, that's another kind of key in having a great founding team. I do think that branding is pretty important. I think it's, to be honest, definitely something that sets Seek apart from the pack.
Right.
I'll tell you kind of a funny story about that. When I was starting Seek, my original name for it was ZQL, like ZEQL. And like, I was talking to my aunt who, is a wealth manager at Morgan Stanley that kind of had some use cases in mind. And my aunt was like, that name sucks. Like, I'm not.
She didn't hold back.
Yeah. Yeah. She was very, very honest. She was like, I'm not technical. ZQL, like, I'm never going to use that. But she was a big fan of Gwyneth Paltrow. And she was like, Gwyneth Paltrow, like, has this brand called Goop. And she got advised that you need a brand with 2 consecutive vowels. So that just got me thinking, okay, if I'm going to have a better name, like, got to think of something good with 2 consecutive vowels. So that's kind of how I ended up thinking of Seek, and my aunt loved Seek. So that's kind of how we went with it. I think just having like a really great name or great brand, just something timeless, it can really keep you going because you're like, I need this brand to endure. It's too good not to survive. It's a brand that's going to win. I think just like having those little things that like show that you're obsessed with the business. You're thinking about how it's going to succeed and you just have that like winning mentality. I think that can really help you stand out from the pack.
Yeah, you put it very clearly. Who's your team? What's your product look like? Do you have anybody that's really interested in it? Like, as you said, even signing letters of intent are really important, having that minimum viable product that's something that people can test, that understand what the purpose of what you're doing is, and then demonstrate that you're in it for the long haul, that you've got this idea is that once we're ready, here we go. You're already thinking in terms of the marketing of the product. And I think Seek is a brilliant name.
Nice. I'm glad you think that. My aunt would be proud.
Now, this is a wrap-up question. I ask all of my interviewees this. What one word describes who you are?
That's a really good question. I would say in one word, probably builder. That's definitely something that I realized about myself during COVID that I think helped me decide that I wanted to go the path of a startup founder, as opposed to, like, for example, I was at Citadel during most of COVID. And I could have just stayed at Citadel and worked my way up the ladder to become a portfolio manager. That would have been what I would have tried to do when I was there, and maybe eventually start my own hedge fund. But I think I just had all this time to just take a good look at who I was. And like, I've always been the type of person that I'm always building something. Like before Seek, I was building robots. I was like building trading models for cryptocurrency, like in my free time, like I always like just, hacking something together. I think what I realized what I'm not is I'm not necessarily an analyzer. It can be hard for me to sit still and stare at a piece of paper for like 6 hours. I struggled with that as a quant too, because I was like, my whole job was like writing equations on paper for, months at a time.
Right.
And to do it. But I think what I realized was more core to who I am was I like to build. That was a realization that did lead me down the startup founder path. I think that's a good one word for who I am.
That's brilliant. At some point in your life, you do sort of that self-evaluation, self-assessment. What gets me up in the morning? What do I want to do? And how does that fit with who I am? And so, yeah, I clearly understand that. I appreciate your insights on that. Sarah, thank you so much. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this, and we really appreciate you being part of our podcast series. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. This is so much fun.
Sarah described her journey, starting as an astrophysics researcher at UCLA and Caltech, and then working at financial service companies and on to startups using AI. During this time, she kept noticing the same pattern of inefficiency. She recognized that nearly every professional needs data to do their job effectively, but must engage with a data team for the answers. Concurrently, she saw the growth of AI's large language models and its developing ability to write code. From this, she formed the idea for Seek, using machine learning models that could answer queries directly from non-technical people and solve the problem of scaling up data teams to answer the voracious needs for data across large companies. She provided insights into how Seek uses deep learning abilities to independently understand the nuances of client datasets, taxonomy, and patterns. In a sense, Seek builds each client a customized version of itself. We talked about data accuracy and confidence when responding to queries. Sarah noted that they use the execution accuracy metric, which measures the accuracy of model-generated instructions for each task, compared to human-written instructions. The Seek team also uses a well-known benchmark called SPIDER, which measures the program's understanding of natural language sentences and maps them to meaningful executable queries. Additionally, they've added guardrails that prevent business users from getting bad data. When asked about the significant hurdles she encountered as a CEO and in scaling the business, Sarah pointed out the initial challenge of articulating the use of large language models as the solution she envisioned. This was back in 2021, when her ideas were significantly ahead of the curve, and VCs had limited exposure to such concepts. However, the introduction of ChatGPT significantly eased this task, marking a turning point in the understanding and acceptance of large language models. She described 3 elements investors ask for in an AI pitch. Do customers love the product as one? This is especially true if you're starting and trying to get your first round of funding. If you don't have customers yet but have prospects, ask them to sign letters of intent. This will show that people are excited about what you're working on and will likely become your customers. Next, have you assembled a high-quality founding team? Many investors look to founders' knowledge and experience to move the company forward, especially if they have some pedigree. But since many don't, you'll need a team that gives you a strong foundation. And last, identifying your market is extremely important, but have you considered your brand? In Seek, Sarah saw a name that connected with the company's mission and stood out as timeless. It's one of the many little things that show you're obsessed with the business, thinking about how it will succeed, and have a winning mentality. And the one word she used to describe herself is builder. This description provides an image of someone who pulls the ideas and pieces together and creates or constructs their vision. Sarah said, "I've always been the type of person that is always building something." This realization about herself led her down the startup path to create Seek. And thanks to Sarah for sharing her valuable experience, knowledge, and insights. This podcast is executive produced by John Rebecchi and New York Institute of Technology in conjunction with the School of Management and the Office of Strategic Communications and External Affairs. The Interim Dean of the School of Management and executive producer of this podcast is Deborah Cohn. Our marketing and social media strategist is Patthara Chandaragga, and our audio editor and mixer is Brian Falk from Abacus Entertainment. Special thanks to Professor Ellie Schwartz and Victoria Greco for all their support. Until next time.